All right, and let's have a quick look here. I think we are live. Just to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and post a message at the top of the chat. So welcome everybody. Please let us know your role in organization, and when I see a couple of those coming in, I'll know that we are in fact live. Excellent, lots of those are coming in. So good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is John Dean, and I'm going to be one of your co-hosts for today. Very excited to welcome you to another HR Indaba network webinar. And today we've got a really interesting topic with one of our great supporters of the CHRO community, Compliance Online. They've played an instrumental role in supporting the CHRO community this year. And today's topic is really interesting. I mean, we're talking about policy perfection. And I think when it comes down to policies, there's often a lot of gray areas and a lot of misunderstanding, which we're kind of aware of, but we don't know where the gray areas are or where the misunderstanding is. So this morning, we're going to have a couple of experts with us. So we'll have Elizabeth Stadler, who'll be joining us and giving us some information around what is a perfect policy. Elizabeth will identify some of the gaps and some of the things that we can look out for. And most importantly, some of the things that we need to incorporate or include to make sure that policies are understood and effective. Now, Elizabeth is joining us this morning from Woodstock. She's a plain language and privacy law expert. She's also a speaker, a rehabilitated attorney, and a Lego nerd. So Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you just to jump on camera for a second for us, please. Thank you so much. And then, let's start with the morning. That's probably the friendly thing to do. Hey, morning, Elizabeth.
Morning, how's it?
Good, and yourself?
Can't complain. Sun is shining.
Yeah, just about. Well, just about in Joburg anyway.
I'm coming to you guys from Woodstock in Cape Town.
Nice. Cool. And after Elizabeth's presentation, we'll be hearing from Trinette Peterson. Trinette Peterson is the National QA Head Distribution and DC Responsible Pharmacist over at Adcock Ingram. And Trinette is going to be sharing a bit of a case study with us around the policies that they have implemented, what's worked, what hasn't, and the current situation as well. So Trinette, good morning. Mute and jump off camera. And we can kick things off as soon as you're ready.
There seems to be a slight glitch here. There we go. Okay. So just navigating a new platform, about the 15th platform that I've tried this year. I'm sure all of you are familiar with platform fatigue. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. If you are wondering what on earth is a rehabilitated lawyer, a rehabilitated lawyer is a number of things. One of the things that are really important for today's discussion is that a rehabilitated lawyer is a lawyer that speaks human and is a lawyer that focuses on people instead of the law and on changing behavior. And so I want to use that as sort of a kickoff point is, if we talk about policies, we are primarily talking about documents that have as their purpose to change or to moderate or to inspire or to motivate changes in behavior. And I think if we make that head shift away from just the four corners of the document to the purpose of the document, we already have won a little bit. I think that it's always important to start with why. I always, at this point, nod to one of my favorite authors, Simon Sinek. In all things, he says we must always ask the question why. And the first why that I want to answer this morning is, why do so many policies lie around gathering dust? In other words, they're somewhere in a folder, no one ever reads them. No one ever acts on them. They're hardly ever reviewed. And if you ask people in the organization, very few of them will know what is in that policy, right? So one of the primary reasons why policies gather dust is because people can't understand them. So some of them are problematic because they are quite simply just badly written. Some are well written, but they were written for another organization. I was doing some work for one of the big universities, and I was reading their compliance management policy, and I thought this policy feels a bit familiar, and then realized that they had borrowed it from an insurance company. University, insurance company, quite different. And so it was not surprising that compliance management policy couldn't be implemented. It was not fit for purpose. Sometimes policies don't work because they're not policies at all. And we're going to talk shortly about what is and what is not a policy. Others don't work because people, when they read them, can't figure out what they're supposed to do. We're going to talk definitely about some of the root causes for that. When that person reads a policy, they should be left with a very clear idea of what it is that they have to do, when they have to do it, and perhaps the beginning of how to do it. Others, and we got quite a few questions from you guys before the webinar, and a lot of them were around how to not write policies that are quite so long. TLDR, for those of you who are not familiar with the internet speak, intergenerational language, I call it sometimes. TLDR stands for too long, didn't read. Quite often people are just put off, by the length of the policy. And they just don't read it, or they don't have the time, or they don't feel like they have the time to read it. And then one of the other reasons why policies lie around gathering dust is because they're never implemented. And no, just emailing the policy to everybody is not the same as implementing a policy. And we will definitely talk about what implementation of a policy means. Right, so I have you for 30 minutes this morning. I'm going to try and get through quite a few points this morning. I want to encourage everybody to please ask questions in the chat. I will definitely answer those questions. After I'm done. I'm also going to answer some of the questions that were posted before, and then after today's session, we will definitely send out answers to the questions that we don't get to. But so, without further ado, the other important why. I spend about half my day writing policies, and I really love it. And most of the people who work with me say that I am not well, because who loves policies? But there are so many reasons why I love policies. When a policy is done well, it can increase efficiency. So having an agreed way of working just saves energy, time, and money. I often say to people that the value of a policy is not actually what is in the document. It is all of the difficult conversations and decisions that go before the document. And a lot of that has to do with all of us deciding together or agreeing that this is how we are going to work. It improves teamwork. So when people know exactly what they are supposed to do, they tend to just get on with it. Compliance officers, I find in particular, have a very bad habit of thinking that if a person isn't following a policy, it's because there's something wrong with the person. It's never the reader that has something wrong with them or is stupid or whatever the case may be. The problem often lies either with the person trying to communicate or with the document itself. And so when people know their roles, when they're able to understand and identify their responsibilities, they tend to just do the right thing. They create culture. So a good policy speaks to who an organization is and who the people are who work there and what they stand for. And then lastly, but very importantly, policies are actually there not to fire people, but to protect people. Because again, if we are clear on our roles and responsibilities and we know what the expectations are, the policy protects us, from people trying to perhaps hold us responsible for things that were not our responsibility. So I think that there are very positive reasons why writing good policies matter. And that is why I get excited, when I have to start writing a new policy or help my clients to develop their policies. So I like it. What is it? Right. So I think it's very important to recognize what policies are and what they most definitely are not. And there are a number of documents that we use in order to govern our organizations. Right. And this is a list. It's not a complete list. Sometimes different businesses call these documents by different names or these instruments or tools. Firstly, most organizations have somewhere where they've written up their mission, what it is that they want from life, and their values. So who they are, what they believe, their strategies. So how are they going to live those values? What is it that they want to achieve? And then we start getting into a bit more detail with business plans. Business plans are, as the name suggests, these are the actions that we have to take in order to meet our strategic objectives. And policies fit somewhere in the middle. I'm going to show you a definition of policies, but they sit somewhere in the middle, and mostly they are used to answer the question, who is responsible for what? Right? So roles and responsibilities is often the core function of a policy. And then below the policy, or supporting the policy, if you will, you have things like standards, which tells us these are the things that we must do. Guidance, these are the things that we should do, or this is the suggested way of doing things. Process maps. A process is a collection of activities that are directed at a particular objective. So let's say onboarding a new employee, that's a process, and we might have maps of how that process works. We might have procedures, which are the formal documents in which we document these processes. And then we might have things like standard operating procedures or operational manuals or whatever you want to call them. But these are all types of governance documents, and policies sit somewhere in the middle. And I think that the purpose of a policy is to articulate the principles or a framework of setting out how you are going to go about achieving a strategy, whether it has to do with employment or compliance or risk management or competition law or POPI or whatever the case may be. It is a set of principles that sets out a framework of how you are going to meet a particular policy objective, right? Principles. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But it is all about ensuring that we do things in a controlled way, in a standardized way, that we have this mutual agreement of this is how we are going to work. So that is what a policy is. Quite often, we find documents and our clients are calling them policies. So for instance, yesterday I was looking at an intellectual property policy. It's 80 pages long. I could not find a policy statement. As far as I could tell, what this organization was doing was explaining intellectual property law to each other. Right, and that's fantastic, and one should comply with intellectual property law. But that is not a policy. That is a guidance, perhaps. There was very little. It had very little to do with who in the organization has which role in respect of protecting intellectual property, for instance. Now we're back in policy country. So really learn to identify what is a policy and what is not a policy. Then, a lot of you asked the question or questions to the effect of, how do I write a policy that covers everything? The answer is you can't, right? So there's one thing that this year taught me, and that is that we cannot predict anything. We're not soothsayers, we're not futurists or whatever you want to call it. We can't predict everything that might happen. Nor should we try to. This is how policies get impossibly long and complicated, as if we write the policy or as if we are going to cover every possible scenario or permutation. So stop trying to do that. Rather think in terms of principles, right? So, and if you want to explain how the principle applies to a situation, write guidelines or an assessment procedure or whatever the case may be that you can add to as more sort of eventualities present themselves, but don't try and write for every single possibility. Rather, try and create principles which guide you through every eventuality which might come across our paths. Then many of you also asked for templates or about the contents of specific policies. So a lot of you asked about working from home policies. So I want to come clean. I do not believe in templates. In fact, I think that templates tend to lead to bad policy making. And the reason for that is, when I spoke about my client earlier, who's a university who copied and pasted, by the way, verbatim, so much so that they didn't even always take the insurance company's name out of the policy, a compliance management policy. A compliance management policy for an FSP shouldn't be the same as a compliance management policy for a university. So the value of a policy is created by having those difficult conversations about what are our principles, not everybody else's, and then deciding what is right for your organization. If you've had those conversations, the policy almost becomes of secondary importance. But by all means, benchmark is what we call it. Benchmarking is a code for Googling stuff. Right, so that's where I go, okay, how did other people do this? I usually do it once I've had the difficult conversations to make sure that I haven't left anything out. Or sometimes when I just don't know where to start, I Google for inspiration. But be very careful that you look at organizations that are similar to yours. So don't think that, you can apply what goes for an insurance company to a group of agriculture companies, for instance, right? So just be very, very suspicious of templates, be very suspicious of just copying and pasting other organizations' policies, because what it leads to is a policy that can't be implemented because, again, not fit for purpose. Right. So that is what I wanted to say about learning to identify a policy and understanding that policies are very, very personal to organizations. The second one is realizing that we're not writing for ourselves. So I'm assuming that everybody who is on the call today at some point have either already written a policy or will write policies in future. You are not writing for yourself. you are writing for other people. You're writing for employees in some respects. Sometimes you might also be writing for a regulator, but primarily you are writing for your employees. And so you need to think of those users, we call them. U is for user. So in a discipline like UX design, for instance, which we use all the time when we think about policy design, you need to think about who is your audience, who are these readers or users. And here we get to a definition of effective writing. Right, so this is by a woman called Annetta Cheek. She's widely considered to be the mother of plain English. And her definition for me is still the best definition of plain language. So she says, well, a communication is in plain language if it meets the needs of its intended audience, not meets the needs of the compliance officer or of the HR department, meets the needs of its intended audience, i.e. employees, by using language, structure, and design so clearly and effectively that the audience has the best possible chance of readily finding what they need, not you, understanding it and using it. Okay, so we're going to come back to this definition, but you can see here that it is focused on the reader. So you need to get a firm grip on your empathy and think about who are the people who are going to read this policy. And a lot of you asked questions that already showed that you were thinking about the reader, right? So you asked questions like, how do I make policies understandable to low-level workers? So I made certain assumptions here about what you meant when you said low-level workers, and that is that perhaps they have lower rates of literacy, for instance, right? So how do I write a policy about often complicated concepts for an audience who may not be able to understand complex language? And there are quite a few, strategies that you can employ, but what it means is that you have to hone in on what is essential in the policy. You have no room for fluff. You need to focus on who must do what, when, and how. Who, what, when, how. Those are very important words in a policy writer's arsenal. I often use a strategy when I have to be focused on simplicity and clarity, where I will write a policy statement or principle, and then I will say to myself, this means that, and generally what comes after that phrase is actually what ends up in the policy. Right? So your first draft is hardly ever simple or clear. You go, this means that, and whatever comes after that phrase tends to be the clearer version of whatever it is that you wanted to articulate. Use lots of examples, right? So we're not writing for every eventuality, but real life examples help people to understand what it is that you are trying to say. In instances where we are dealing with audiences who maybe can't read at all, we have in the past made video policies. A colleague of mine, we're all very proudly South African, there's a lot of leaders in information design in this country, for instance, wrote employment policies as comics, right? So it is entirely possible to use visuals or videos in order to help people who are not literate or who have low levels of literacy. And then think about the communication around the policy. So the policy is just, and one of you pointed it out in one of your questions, that's just one part of this whole communication strand, right? So think about when people read policies and they have questions, where will they go? Who will they ask? Do we perhaps have some training on the policies? Do we perhaps have, when it's a really important policy, a more sort of consultative process where we are going through the policy together? So Rob De Roy wrote those comic book and contracts and policies, for instance, almost always has a sort of guided read through. But think about the communication around the policy and how you can support people to understand the policy. Then stakeholders, right? Policy writing is not a solitary pursuit. If you are sitting alone in a room with a blank page trying to dream up a policy, you are not doing it right. You need to get everybody in the organization who are affected by the policy and who you need to make decisions in a room so you can talk about what the issue is that this policy has to resolve. If there is no issue that a policy is trying to resolve, then there shouldn't be a policy. Very often my job is about deleting unnecessary policies. One of my clients said the other day, I think he was complaining, but I took it as a compliment, that Elizabeth, I basically pay you to delete things. I wear that with pride, right? So the reason why I think policies fail or succeed often has to do with whether the right people were involved in the drafting process. There is this fantastic website called unsuckit.com. It's a jargon dictionary, and this is how they define stakeholders. So stakeholders are anyone in an organization who will kill a good idea out of spite or political ill will. I think that is exactly right. So you need to get them on your side, and you need to get them on your side early when you are diagnosing what the issue is that you are wanting to regulate or want to resolve through this policy. Then I want to show you a quick video. For me, the whole ball game is whether your policy identifies roles and responsibilities clearly. And this little video is a bit of a cautionary tale. I think some of you might recognize it. There we go.
Muriel?
Yes, Mavis?
Do you know that you've just gone through a red light and over a roundabout, and you haven't even slowed down?
Am I driving?
Muriel, you are driving.
What's really scary is that your insurance premiums are based on her driving.
Oh dear.
With My Drive Style from MyWay, you only pay a premium based on your driving.
Right. So you don't want people to read your policies and then, you know, be left with the thought, am I driving, right? So roles and responsibilities are incredibly important because we need to ensure that people understand exactly what they have to do, right? So I always say to people, you know, that we need to ensure that people know with absolute clarity who, in terms of this policy, is responsible to do what, when, and how. I see my slides are having difficulty loading. I'm just going to try and do it again. Give me 1 second. You know, there we go. This presentation just wouldn't be the same without some glitches, right? So
There we go.
I always say to people as well, you know, imagine I was standing in the middle of my kitchen. I have many children. And I say, will someone please clean the kitchen? No one is going to clean the kitchen. I have to say, Hannah, it is your responsibility to clean the kitchen by the time I get home. This is from when I used to leave home, right? There's a big difference between saying someone must do something about this really important topic and saying you are responsible to do this, that, and the other thing. Right? So again, when people don't comply with policies, internal audit, compliance folk, lawyers, etc., we often think it's because there's something wrong with the person. But actually, if you think about it, no right-minded person will take on a responsibility if they don't understand that it's their responsibility. So you mentioned that I also, for my sins, specialize in privacy law. So we're quite busy at the moment. But what I always find interesting is in about 80% of data breaches, I find that a root cause analysis shows that the person who is now being disciplined didn't know that the thing that they didn't do was their responsibility. And that is almost always the result of a policy that was unclear on that score. So I can't emphasize this enough. If you don't hear anything of what I say today, is that if your policies are not clear and specific on who has which role or responsibility, you are at some point or another going to be confronted with a person being non-compliant because simply they didn't know that they were supposed to do things differently. So how do we assist people to understand the roles and responsibilities that we articulate in policies? And there are a couple of strategies that has to do with just effective communication. One of the ones that are very important is to have good headings in your document. So remember I said, you know, sometimes people are just put off by the length of the policy. Sometimes they are put off because they can't navigate a policy. You need to, and if we go back to that definition, it also said you need to at least assist people in finding the information that they need. Good, clear, articulated headings in your policy will do that. And, you know, what you have to also confront is that no one's ever going to go, ooh, today I'm going to read policies. I'm so bloomin' excited, right? So we need to inspire people to read the policies, and we need to definitely not make it harder for them because they are already reluctant readers. So you asked about how to keep the language simple. If you focus on structure and making it easy for people to find what they need, you will have more room to get away with complexity. Because sometimes the topic is just complex, but if you structure your policy well, and if you make your policy easy to navigate, then people will be less tired by the time that they actually get to what it is that you want to say. And so they will have more capacity to deal with complex issues. So you have to think about how can you help the reader. There's such a thing as reading fatigue, and we need to help people to expend their energy in the right places. And one of the ways to do that is to have a clear structure and well-written headings. Then, the passive voice must not be used. For those of you who remember your English from matric, you would realize the irony on this slide is that I just used the passive voice. So for those of you who don't remember passive versus active voice, we have over the years perfected a way of identifying it. And it is if I can complete a sentence by inserting by zombies, then I'm writing in the passive voice. So the passive voice must not be used by zombies. Right, so if I had to rewrite that in the active voice, would say zombies should never use the passive voice. Right, so you see what I did there? And again, this is about making sure that people understand who is responsible. When you write in the active voice, the who is hidden. The passive voice must not be used. By who? Okay, so it's incredibly important. If there's the one language rule that you must learn and familiarize yourselves with, it's passive voice versus active voice. I'm not saying that the passive is never appropriate, but in a policy, it is hardly ever appropriate to use the passive voice because policies are about roles and responsibilities. So this is an example, just to sort of let this sink in from a policy that I was reviewing this week. We must ensure that data management plans are provided when required. By who? Zombies? Right? No. So see what happens when I kill the zombie? Researchers must provide a research data management plan when they apply for funding. So I use this very simple formula. Who must do what, how, and sometimes by when. Who must do what, how, and by when. Okay, so kill the zombies. But there's another thing that you have to kill. Kill the jargon. Right, so jargon is about as bad as zombies. So zombies eat brains, jargon, and passive voice also eat brains. So it's one of the things that we will often say, well, this reader just didn't understand, or they are slow, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes it's just because their brain was eaten by zombies or jargon. Right, so stop using jargon. Write in human instead. So, for instance, sometimes when our clients give us leeway to be a little bit playful with policies, and yes, that is possible, we often focus on when we have to use jargon because that is how the law describes a particular concept, and obviously when you're in compliance, you have to be accurate, but explain the concepts to people and find human ways to explain it. Right, so we were in this instance talking to students and young adults. So we said, well, the probation period is a little bit like living together before we get married, right? A little bit playful. Now they understand probation. But the point is, don't assume that people understand what words like probation or compliance means. Then, people are motivated by consequences, right? So the research has shown it in cognitive science time and time again that people are motivated by consequences, right? So if you don't follow a policy, something bad will happen. Most policies will just say, well, if you don't follow this policy, you'll be faced by disciplinary action. Okay, but that is not good enough because in order for consequences to motivate, they need to be fairly specific. Also, the thing that I want to point out is sometimes, the consequence to the individual, sure, if they don't follow the policy is important, but the consequence to the organization will be bigger. So this is actually a bit of wording out of my own company's policies. And one of the important things for a consultancy is that our employees must be very careful when they give away our intellectual property. So how do I explain that to them? Well, in each business has their secret sauce and things and skills that make them unique and that their clients pay for. This knowledge and these skills took years to develop. If we give them away for free, our business will fail. It is another way of explaining a consequence. If the business fails, you will not have a job, right? We have found over time, we tested this statement against statements like if you disclose our confidential information without our written permission, you will be faced with disciplinary action, does not motivate people. This motivated people because they understand the why. So we're back to Simon Sinek. I find that, most things in life come back to finding the why. Why is the most important word. Then you need to implement your policies. So a lot of organizations think implementing a policy means emailing it to everybody, and that's it. That's often also known as socializing the policy. I find that bit of jargon very funny. I showed the policy to you, so therefore it is implemented. From a compliance management perspective, policies will only be considered implemented if someone monitors whether the policy is being followed and if there are things that happen when a policy isn't followed. So where we remedy that non-compliance, that's when a policy is implemented. But in the beginning, when you draft a policy, I encourage you to have the following things in the back of your minds, right? So policy implementation functions essentially on 3 levels. So policies have an impact on people. They need to change their behavior. You need to empower people to change their behavior. This usually means training, right? Policies will impact how people work. How people work is determined by processes. So you need to think, how does this policy impact our existing processes? How will we need to change them? And again, we have to empower people to follow the new processes. And then sometimes policies have an implication for our infrastructure. So do we have the right hardware, software, whateverware in order to follow this policy? Most policies are never implemented because they are impractical. Right? A good example that comes up a lot for me at the moment is when we talk about destroying information securely, and a lot of companies are taking on paperless policies, or they have a policy that you have to destroy information, physical information, by shredding it. Except then they don't think, okay, if we have to shred information and we have to buy this amount of shredders that can shred this amount of paper per minute in order for people to actually have the time to shred the papers. So you need to think about impact on people, impact on processes, impact on infrastructure, and then have an implementation plan. It's not as easy as just writing the policy. And you have to think about these things as you write the policy, because you shouldn't be writing policies that are impractical. So this assessment needs to happen before your policy gets approved. And then lastly, yes, this is the last one. Well done for those of you who stuck it out. Testing. Right? It is impossible for the author of a document to determine whether that document is understandable, because you know what you meant. This is the same thing that happens when you proofread your own work. Why do we not see mistakes when we proofread our own work? It's because we know what we have written and our brains work in shortcuts, so you don't read every word that you wrote yourself. That's why your ability to proofread your document gets better and better the longer time you let elapse between when you wrote it and when you proofread it. Is because you are forgetting what you wrote. So you're looking at it with fresh eyes, right? What this means for policies is that you cannot be the judge and jury of whether your policy is understandable. The readers have to be. So you need to find ways to test whether they understand your documentation. And think about this like giving them a comprehension test. And you can do this formally and informally. You can use tools like Policy Passport, or you can just, give the policy to 10 people and ask them a couple of questions about what they understood and what they didn't understand. And but do test your writing, even if it is informally, because again, you can't judge whether your own writing is clear. Hopefully you knew what you meant. You have to test it on the users. So we're straight back to user-focused, user-centric policies, reader-centric policies, having empathy, and then above all being pragmatic for the organization that you work for. And that is about that from me. Just about enough, I think. As I said, I am going to stick around and answer questions in the chat, so please fire away. And thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. There is absolutely no doubt after your presentation that you certainly are a plain language expert. I think you've taken what can be a really complex and complicated topic and really made it simple and given us some great guidelines. So thank you very much for sharing your tips with us here today.
Good pleasure.
And then, just to echo on what you've said, you can already see lots of nice comments coming in the chat there. But please, if you have any additional questions for Elizabeth, go ahead and type them into the chat now. We'll try and answer as many of them here today as possible. And any ones that we don't get around to, we'll follow up with a personalized email after the session. The same goes for those of us who also ask questions in advance. I know Elizabeth touched on a lot of those points here today, but we'll also follow up with personal responses as well. All right, Trinette, I'm going to invite you to come on camera. And Elizabeth, you're welcome to jump off camera for a second while we have our discussion here. So good morning and welcome, Trinette. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Awesome. So Trinette, we now have a much better idea regarding what is a policy, what is the importance of a policy, how should policies be written. Now, you were working over at Adcock Ingram, of course, being a big pharma, it's probably a pretty highly regulated environment. So maybe you can just give us some ideas around some of the sort of policies and the regulations that you are forced to adhere to.
Great, thank you. Yes, so as you've mentioned, we are a pharmaceutical company. Most of you are well familiar with Adcock Ingram. We produce and manufacture pharmaceuticals and medication, and we have to adhere to the laws and regulations of South Africa. Obviously, the Medicines Act, the Pharmacy Act, we are regulated by the South African Pharmacy Council. We also have international customers that come and audit us. So it is obviously a regulated environment because we have to produce medication that has to be ingested and used by end users. So we have got strict guidelines and policies that we need to adhere to. We also need to write these policies and standard operating procedures so our staff know exactly, as Elizabeth said, what to do, how to do it, and when to do it by.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and perhaps I know that obviously you are a client of Policy Passport and Compliance Online, but if you can just talk to us about what the traditional sort of process looks like, and how maybe simple or complicated that may be. How long do we need to store documents and files for?
Definitely. So in our environment, we have to save documentation for up to 7 years. And when you talk about pharmaceutical products, you need to save some of the documentation for up to a year after the product has expired. So for us, prior to Policy Passport, everything was manual. We were killing forests, basically. If we look at one of our distribution centers, they've got 80 staff members on site just for the one site. So when we had to give training, we had to get all of these people into a room, literally make copies of our policies, stamp them, photocopy everything, hand them out, give people tests. They had to read everything. We had to have a classroom set up, explain it to the staff. And if you are a fast reader and you can go through your policy quickly, you had to wait for the guy that still had to catch up. And then you still need to write the test. Somebody has to mark it. You need to get all of that documentation back and gather the info. So it could take up to days for us just to train our staff complement on 1 or 2 policies and SOPs. So it was really time consuming and a lot of paper that we used to get people the information and to give them the information.
Okay. Thanks, Janette. I know when we were doing a bit of preparation in advance, and you said it was a nightmare when you'd be going through like an annual audit, and they would say, was this individual trained or did they understand the specific policy? And you'd have to run down the corridor and dig through files and try and find the information. Yeah, okay. So it sounds like that's a lot more streamlined. Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah. So I was going to say that exactly that. You had to sit and tell the auditor, I'm so sorry, I need to run to my office or send somebody to your office, which is not in the fancy boardroom where you have the auditor, because you can't drag your entire filing cabinet with all your staff records. So you would send somebody to a cabinet which they might have never seen, hoping they are getting the right file because you've got 2 John Mahlangus working in your warehouse, just for them to bring it back, and it's either the wrong file or half the documents aren't filed. So it really takes time. And if you are in an FDA audit, for example, they give you 1 minute to produce documentation. If it's not there, it's a finding, it's not done. So it really takes time to go and retrieve the documents and records to produce to the auditor.
Okay. Wow, that sounds very hectic and very, very strict. So I certainly don't envy you when it comes around to audit time. Trinette, we've obviously spoken a little bit about the past and what the process looked like previously. being a Policy Passport customer or client at the moment, could you just give us a basic overview as to what that platform is, and then obviously how that's helped or made your life a bit easier?
Definitely. So, Policy Passport is a document management system, or a document review system rather. So you would upload documentation and you could use that to review with various groups and users that are based in other areas and not necessarily in one office. And for our setup in Adcock Ingram, this system is useful for us because we use it as a training platform, although it is not an official training platform. But in our instance, we require staff to read a document, complete a test, give feedback on the document, and then we have the record of that completed test. So for us now, it's so easy. You literally log in, it's web-based. So anywhere where you are, which office, doesn't matter, from home, you log in, you upload your document, you create tests, or you ask a mandatory question at the end to say, do you understand? Do you have any feedback? You can ask the person to acknowledge that they have read the document, and then you can run a report to see in Excel holistically what is happening on your site, who completed the document, which date, what's outstanding. So for us, it not only saved time because you couldn't get all the staff in one room, and also thinking of where we are currently with COVID, you can't get everybody in one room to train them. So this allows us to still do training and business continues, because when staff have a few minutes, they can sit at their desk, log in, read something, complete a test, business runs as usual. You don't need to take them out of their work to sit in a classroom and do training. So for us, it was so easy, just logging in, uploading documents, creating test questions, and people use it, and that's it.
Okay, perfect. Now, during Elizabeth's presentation, she mentioned something quite interesting, and I forget the exact wording, but she said something along the lines of just because the policy has been distributed or discussed doesn't mean that it's understood or interpreted. And you said that you can check and see whether a document has been read. How would you measure comprehension, or if there's been a knowledge transfer or just basic understanding? And sorry, Trinette, sorry, just before you answer, I see lots of people are asking in the chat, and I'm getting lots of private messages regarding the slides and the distribution of the presentation. We will be sending all of you a link to the recording shortly after our webinar ends here today, so you will be getting that information. Sorry, Trinette.
Not a problem. So you can actually, with the Policy Passport system, log in and go to the questions and see exactly which questions were repeatedly answered incorrectly. And that doesn't just tell you, okay, well, the person didn't understand, but is it because the person didn't understand the question, so I formulated the question incorrectly? Or is my policy actually not clear? And as Elizabeth has said, the whole point is that you need to write clear communication so it's understood by people. What's the point of having it if nobody understands it and you can't use it? So this system allows you to actually see exactly which questions were repeatedly answered incorrectly. And there you could delve in further to see, is the question unclear or is the policy actually unclear?
Okay, very interesting. Have you got any recent examples of how you've used that, or just to give us a kind of real life application around comprehension and understanding of policies and procedures?
So, obviously, when COVID started, we had to scramble and get everybody up to date. And one of the most important things is obviously how to use a single-use face mask. And to write this in a document is one thing, but we saw that our staff didn't really understand the donning and doffing section of the face mask. And so Policy Passport actually allowed us to upload a link to a video, which took you to the WHO website, so you could see the video of how to use the face mask. Also, how to wash your hands and nails correctly, because it's just not practical getting 80 people in a bathroom or in a warehouse to show them physically how to wash your hands. So the system enabled us to see firstly, people answered the questions incorrectly, so they weren't sure. Then we had to go through all of it again and just upload a link to a video to see, okay, now we're going to show you how to do it correctly. So that helped us a lot, and our staff. And after that, you could immediately see people's masks were on the right way. They didn't wear them under their chin or expose the nose, so everybody knew exactly what to do.
Okay, wow, that's amazing. So it looks like it's not only does it give you a central kind of area or platform where you can access data and information, it also sounds like it saves a lot of time, because it looks like it's automating or removing a lot of manual processes. And when I say manual, I mean, like, to example, getting 80 people in a room together. So it sounds like it saves a lot of time from that perspective.
Definitely, and everything is right there. So when you are in an audit, and that is our big example, because we go through audits every few weeks. So you literally log in, you give the auditor what they are asking in the next minute, because everything is electronically, and it does definitely save time. You've got your results straight away, so you can immediately see which staff member requires retraining, perhaps a classroom or one-on-one setup to explain to that person exactly what they are reading, and then understand what the person's limitations are. Why do they not understand? Is it the policy, or is it the questions, or is it something else? So it's definitely a time saver for us.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you, Trinette. I see we are coming up to 10:02, so I just wanted to check if there's any final sort of thoughts or tips that you wanted to impart with our audience before we invite Elizabeth back on camera and answer some live questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, so I think from my side, coming from a big corporate, it's obvious that you don't need to do things that your company did 30 years ago. I think COVID has taught us a lot in this year. It just shows you that if you look at your problem or your policies or your documents or your training system just from a different angle, change is possible. And we know, let's be honest, people don't like change. Some senior managers say, how is this system ever going to work for us? So I think it's important to show people the benefits and how easy it is to use it. We always say, if you can use a smartphone, you could use our Policy Passport training platform, because you log in, you complete the test, and there you go. So I want to say that it doesn't mean that your company did things this way and you can't change it. It is actually possible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Elizabeth, I'm going to invite you back on camera now, please. Thank you. All right. So I see, because you are the overachiever that you are, Elizabeth, I see you've responded to lots of those questions in the chat already. So some of those that haven't already been responded to, you are. I think there were a couple in the build-up that I wouldn't mind addressing now, and maybe we can get a couple of answers to. So I see you've touched on a couple of the ones related to policies around where we are now around COVID and things like that. There were a couple of questions around what is the sort of ideal length or description of specific policies.
Less is more with policies, right? So I think of people in terms of, bandwidth or airtime, right? So let's say it's just a fact of life. We're all bombarded and suffer from information overload, that you only have a finite amount of time and space in people's heads. So you need to make sure that you get your important messages across. So one way to put it would be to say, well, you can say 100 things, and because people are overwhelmed, they absorb 3. Or you can say 10 very important things, and because you're only talking about the 10 most important things, they can absorb 9. So you have to push back against this feeling that you have to address everything all the time and address the important things. So there's no answer to that question, because it will depend on the context and the kind of audience and the topic. But in general, just try and keep things to what is relevant to that audience, and you will see the length of your policies decrease quite exponentially.
Okay, perfect. Then there was another question around the best way to write policies to incorporate health, safety, and well-being, and then disciplinary. I realize these are all very kind of separate areas. But Trinette, maybe we can hear from you around some of the considerations that you had to think of when obviously designing policies, using policy passports, and then Elizabeth, we can get some of your views or thoughts around that as well.
From my side, obviously, as I've mentioned, being in a pharmaceutical environment, we are regulated and we have to work according to a set of documents, laws and regulations. So you write the policy and you write the SOP because you want the staff member to know what to do, how to do it, when to do it by, and who is responsible for each step. But then you also need to make sure that you comply with the laws and regulations as set out by the regulators. So you need to have all of that in mind and write a policy and an SOP that means something, because we've seen you can have a policy or a document that's 30 pages or 80 pages, but what does it tell you? So we have to have policies that are concise, that are short, to the point. You don't want people to read all of this and then you wonder, okay, what did I read now and what do I need to do? So it has to be clear for everybody to understand.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Elizabeth, what would you add?
I would add my tip is always to start with the roles and responsibilities. So to start, what are the roles that I'm identifying and what are their responsibilities? And that forces you to think in terms of who must do what, when, how. Who, what, when, how. And then you almost distill from that the principles, because I find that all too often, there's no roles and responsibilities section, or it's right at the end. Whereas that's the thing that people want to know immediately. It's like, so how does this affect my day-to-day work? So just think about that: who, what, how, when. Those important 3-letter words.
Okay, perfect. And one of the other things that you mentioned in your presentation as well, and this was one of the pre-questions around how do we get buy-in from senior leadership or senior management. I remember you saying after the Simon Sinek and the why slide, you said invite or get involvement from your stakeholders.
Yes. You need to, in order to get buy-in, right? It's almost the same as when I said you need to get in touch with your empathy when you write. Is when you get buy-in, you can't think of in terms of what is important to you. So let's say you're talking to the board, right? Compliance in general is not all that important to the board. What is important to the board? Well, either making money, right? Let's make that assumption. 2 ways to make money is sell more, spend less. Okay, so now whatever policy you have to write, try and demonstrate to the board how it will make you more efficient, how it will reduce maybe your payroll, but think in terms of the frame of reference of the person whose buy-in you need, and that greases the wheels enormously. So just always think. You can also think in terms of risk. So one of the things that I read the minute it comes out is a whole bunch of organizations have these reports, things that CEOs are worried about. Right, so go and read what are the 10 things globally that CEOs are worried about, and connect your policy as a solution to one of those things, because then all of a sudden you're solving their problems, but don't make your problems theirs. That doesn't work. That doesn't inspire anybody to support anything, I find.
Okay, perfect. So always thinking about it from the reader's perspective, how they're going to interpret it. I liked what you said in the beginning of the webinar about the misunderstanding or miscomprehension is based on your structure or writing of the policy rather than the person's comprehension.
Yeah, it's never the reader's fault, ever. There's sometimes, but 9 times out of 10. You can't blame the reader. You blame the message or the writer. It's obviously self-deprecating there. Yeah. So
Trinette, for you, that must have been quite, I guess, a challenging area to navigate. You mentioned that the scenario that you gave around the changing of the masks. Elizabeth mentioned earlier that not all people are as proficient in English or document reading as others. So do you almost have to structure or tier policies based on certain levels of employees, or how would that work?
Yes, so in our instance, we have a lot of blue collar workers, as we call them, and we've got people that work on forklifts. They just pick and pack. They don't even have an email address or access to a PC. So we need to keep all of that in mind. And also, we've got executive management, ExCos, CFOs, CEOs. So we need to make sure that we are writing the policies for the people that need to use them. And our SOPs are exactly like that. So I would not give my managing director my SOPs to read, but they are written for the staff on the floor that have to use them and have to obviously get the process done. So you do need to keep plain language. I fully agree with Elizabeth here that what's the point of writing everything in this la-di-da English and nobody understands what you're saying? You will find that you have so many errors in your processes, and then you need to think of, okay, hang on, is it my policy or is it my SOP that's unclear, or do people just not understand what they should do? So all of that ties in to how you write these policies and what does it mean. So you have to put all of that thought in place when you write them, definitely.
And it's hard work. And policy writing is incredibly hard work. If it feels easy to you, you're probably not doing it right.
You're copying and pasting from someone else's template.
Yeah, exactly. It's a problem. It's a problem that you have to solve, or a puzzle. I think that's why I like it so much. So, but it feels like hard work, particularly initially. What we're suggesting is not easy, but it's very rewarding. So this is the pep talk portion of today's talk.
This is the motivation, hey?
It's so much more fun than copying and pasting.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Jeanette. I see we are fast approaching the top of our hour. It's 2 minutes to 12. So I just wanted to thank you both for your time this morning and for imparting some knowledge and sharing some tips and tricks with the CHRO community. We value your input in this morning's session, so thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me. It was fun.
Good, I'm glad. And I think lots of people had fun here as well. And then I also wanted to thank Compliance Online and Policy Passport for obviously backing the CHRO community and being an active member this year. You'll notice that we have a couple of other upcoming webinars. So if you are looking for further development and upskilling, I'm going to go ahead and type an email address in the chat now. And if you go ahead and click on chro.co.za/events, you'll be able to register for some of the upcoming events here. So we can see we've got a session tomorrow around retaining your star performers. And then early next week, we'll be discussing the war for talent with Old Mutual and Workday. So once again, want to thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days. And just to reiterate one more time, there will be a copy of the recording coming across to us this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you in another online session with the HR Indaba Network. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Jeanette.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Cheers, cheers.